الله أكبر الله أكبر.
الحمد لله نحمده ونستعين به ونستغفره ونتوب إليه، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله، وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله، أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون. عباد الله، أوصيكم وإياي بتقوى الله، أوصيكم وإياي بتقوى الله، أوصيكم وإياي بتقوى الله. واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ كنتم أعداء فألف بين قلوبكم فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا، وكنتم على شفا حفرة من النار فأنقذكم منها. الحمد لله على نعمة الإسلام، الحمد لله على نعمة الإيمان، الحمد لله على نعمة الإحسان، الحمد لله على نعمه كلها ظاهرها وباطنها. الحمد لله على نعمة حبيبنا وسيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين. الحمد لله على نعمة القرآن، الحمد لله على نعمة يوم الجمعة وخصه الله بهذه الأمة، يتلاقى المؤمنون ويتلاقى المسلمون ويتبادلون السلام. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أما بعد، Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in revealing the last revelation in the Quran, and beginning the revelation with one of the most profound beginning, which is a command to read, to recite, to comprehend also could be deduced from it. And therefore our tradition is a tradition of knowledge, an acquisition of knowledge. And if we think about the importance and the emphasis that is placed in the Quran on knowledge acquisition, it has to be that the purpose of the last message for all of us as a human being, it is in the acquisition of knowledge, and that being the avenue to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ, in describing himself from all the descriptions, he described himself as a mu'allim. He described himself as a mu'allim, as a teacher, as a person who came to really take us from the multiple darknesses into the light. Now I'm beginning with discussing knowledge, acquisition of knowledge. We're knowing that Allah is the all-knowledgeable, nothing beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has all knowledge. What we get is only a glimpse of what Allah has permitted us to have knowledge of. But I wanted to speak specifically about the situation in Nigeria with Boko Haram, in order for us to understand what is taking place in the specific circumstances, and to essentially contextualize the situation in Nigeria so we could understand exactly what is occurring and how what is taking place is essentially a turning back, and also could be seen as an aggression on Islam itself. Now we know that the kidnapping of a large number of young girls, the number is still really, we're not sure, is it 284, 300? And then the statements that are attributed to the group that have kidnapped these girls, that they will put them into slavery, sell them. Now all of this is creating a particular global understanding of Islam, that me and you were engaging on a daily basis to try to just get our sense of what Islam is all about. And now you have a major event like this taking place that essentially supersedes all of our efforts just to comprehend on a daily basis what the Islamic tradition is talking to us and asking us to do. Now first is the name of the organization, Boko Haram, does not mean Western education is haram or is prohibited. That's a translation that is completely incorrect. In order for us to understand the group, in terms of its title, is actually, it has a genealogy on the term that emerges from opposition to colonial education. So Boko Haram, in the sense of using that term to express opposition to education, colonial education that was set up through much of Africa, if not much of the world. And therefore, the Boko Haram essentially is not saying Western education is haram. In essence, it's saying colonial education is prohibited. But that itself has a historical location. When you drudge history and you put it in the present, it gives you a different context altogether. Now, one has to understand African history in general for us to locate why this particular group is acting and reacting this way. Not to rationalize their action, because their action is completely unacceptable, despicable, and has to be spoken of as such. But understanding the genealogy is very important, in order for us to at least understand history and its dynamics in relations to Africa, but also in relations to our circumstances. Now, the 20th century, Africa enters into the 20th century as a totally colonial terrain. Alright, so if you visited Africa, you came into Africa in 1910, 1915, 1920, all of Africa, possibly with the exception of small corners, would have been a colonial possession. Either it was owned by the British, owned by the French, owned by the Dutch, owned by the Italians, owned by the Spaniards. So literally from north to south, from east to west, was a completely colonial enterprise. And colonialism has to be understood. Colonialism has to be understood. In a sense, colonialism came to alter the relationship of societies in relation to materials, meaning resources, but also relationship of individuals to tradition, and individuals to economy, and individuals to the globe. The first part of the colonial enterprise was altering educational structures. The British were masters at rewriting the curriculum. And therefore, across the world, not only in Africa, but also if you speak to people from the Indian subcontinent, there was so much focus on changing the educational material, because it is not enough to put chains on people's hands, because that's easy. Any pickpocket can actually take a small piece of wire and open the chains, right? I used to do it when I was young at school. Right? You just get a lock on the door and you just play around with it and you open it. That's just so crude as a structure to break and take the chains from there. It's actually the mental chains that have to be worked on, that systematically puts a structure where you begin to understand yourself as inferior to a superior that is there. The curriculum that was set in place in the Muslim world was to push Islamic education out and put it in a fossilized structure in only two areas. So Muslim education was to be pushed in inheritance and only family law, and then acts of worship, ibadat. So those are the only two things that Islamic education was maintained. Everything else in society was to be completely adopted to the colonial enterprise. So as such, when we speak of Islam and Muslims today, and this is, I insist on it, we're speaking of a colonial category. Nothing about contemporary Muslims across the world is outside of the colonial structure. Physically we are brown, but mentally we're colonized white, in how we see the world and interact with it, including those elements that we look at in relations to Islam. So that's very important in terms of the education infrastructure across the Muslim world, without exception. Right? Even in some of the locations out in the distant is still subject to the accretion of colonialism as it pertains to the educational structure. Think of it as you're looking at yourself with a set of glasses. That glasses tint everything that you see with coloniality. Now that was not incidental, nor was it an accident. It was actually a deliberate process, and you could read some of these, you know, when somebody's so arrogant that they write about what they want to do, and they boast about it. If you just read the British archives about the colonial structure, they boast about it, how they actually are going to educate a colonial subject that looks at the British in the sense of an awe, as if they're seeing a wali walking around. So we created a colonial walis structurally across the Muslim world. That was by design. That was by design, not an accident. Second is in terms of the economic relations. Economic relations. Economic relations were set up to alter the relationship from economies of cooperation and codependence to a purely capitalist economy with highly colonized structure, moving natural resources to the north for the natural resources to be finished, processed, and brought back to the colonies, so we'll be captive markets. You could actually look across many parts of the Muslim world where natural resources are there. You'll find the natural resources are exported to the north. And if there's agriculture, the agriculture has been transformed into cash crops. And those cash crops are exported to the north, and then finished products are brought in. So again, that was part and parcel of economic discourse. So much so that Muslims have actually adopted this economic discourse, where actually now Muslim economics is actually a contract with Bismillah on top and Alhamdulillah at the bottom, and in between is Adam Smith and economy of scarcity. That's what we have. Not only in here with what you call halal mortgage, no. You go to the middle of the Muslim world, right around Mecca, you will find the same type of economic enterprises, because we have structures of coloniality that was operable in relations to economy. It's again structural. Now just give you a little bit more in terms of economy. Two countries that are Muslims next to each other, they have to trade in accordance to the rules set up by the World Trade Organization. Before that, the General Agreement Trade and Tariffs, and they have to trade with each other with hard currencies, meaning the currencies that are set by the Northern Hemisphere. And that's why if you look at any indicator, say they have what's called reserves of hard currency. What does it mean? Like my money is not hard? The only hard currency is the one that is the euro, the dollar, the British pound, the German franc. Also, they brought in the Japanese, as the Japanese economy went, the Japanese yen. Right? So this is a basket of what's called hard currencies that allow you to trade with your next door neighbor. More so, the structure of economic relations is actually set up to prevent you from developing. So for example, if you happen to plant sesame seed, if you export your sesame seed raw to the north, there is no tariffs on it. There is no taxes on it to export it. But if you process your sesame seed in your own country and export it, there's tariffs on the processed sesame seed. What this makes, disincentivize you're actually creating economic development in your own country to process your own natural resources. And if you relate to what you call the elites in these countries, whom you educated in Harvard, in Oxford, or in some French institution, Sorbonne, they come and they think that they know better, and they reproduce the same economic disadvantages And that's why you look at Africa, since they've been freed for the past 40 years. Why they're so undeveloped? It's a structurally undeveloped. Right? It's structurally done so. We removed the colonial army, but we kept the managers of the colonial enterprise. We removed the army, and we maintained the managers of the colonial enterprise who were already educated to see the world in the eyes of colonial structures. Now, a little bit more about economy, about education, and Muslims' reactions to it. And this is where the problem becomes. As we begin to have an imitative project to try to dredge ourselves from really the depth of despair and the depth of almost loss, we begin to think that the reasons for progress is in materiality. Materiality. We begin to think that it's the material that caused the progress, the development. So we take on an imitative project. This imitative project essentially begins to think that the Northern Hemisphere, the colonial motherlands, are the source of development, so we begin to try to follow the same pattern. And that same pattern, essentially how to keep up with the Joneses. You're never going to keep up with the colonial Joneses. Right? You cannot keep up with them. Plus, also, you are disconnecting yourself from your tradition in reality. So you try to get as much Adam Smith, Darwin, Nietzsche, all of the philosophers that are there, which have done great work. You could actually access them, but you think in the materiality of the structure of development. So we actually begin to worship power rather than the divine. So we think that the reason for progress is in the material, not in the divine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that determines the affairs of society. It's He who changes the conditions. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore Allah says, Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change their own conditions. But changing your own condition does not mean that you take more of the material. It's actually you disconnect from the material. Doesn't mean that you don't develop, but it's not the material that is the cause of your elevation. It's actually you're disconnecting of the material. More so, we develop, and here Du Bois did massive work in relation to the African American community, double consciousness, where we begin to look ourselves in the way that the colonial is looking at ourselves, and we act the role that has been cast for us. And this is what I say, that we act our Muslimness. So Boko Haram is acting their colonial Muslimness. What the colonial Muslims is mean that the Muslims are backward. They are anti-civilization, anti-education. They have not partaken in modernity. But all these terms are problematic because you can't speak of modernity without coloniality. You can't speak of modernity without capitalism. You can't speak of modernity without war and destruction. But it becomes a very simplistic way to act Muslimness as a way of actually not thinking clearly without your double consciousness. It's like you have been defined by how the colonial structure have prescribed for you those acts that you need to undertake. And therefore what you have in here is literally a group that is emerging within modernity, not outside of modernity. And that's the challenge, because every time people are speaking about Muslims group, not only Boko Haram, but Al-Qaeda and others, they say these people came from the caves. No, these are not the cave people. These people actually are born out of modernity, colonial modernity. And they're reacting in colonial modernity according to the same conditions that have been placed upon them. And their violent action is actually a response as well as an articulation of the prescription that has been placed upon them. So we need actually to say, no, we're not talking about individuals within modernity. These are outside of modernity, these are actually within modernity. They're in modernity in the structure of thought. They're in modernity in terms of how they act. They're in modernity in terms of education. They're in modernity in human discourse and interaction. And therefore, what they did is they only look at something in the historical past in order to rationalize modernity. Something that anyone who studied nation-state formation will understand. You locate the genesis of a nation-state in some distant past and you claim it to be your own. Muslims today, they look at the Quran and the Hadith, and you give anybody any written material, they could rationalize anything. Literally, you could give me enough time, you could go a few verses of the Quran and a few Hadith, I could rationalize for you a whole bunch of stuff. And therefore, a modern person that is skilled in navigating the text can actually rationalize these discourses, and that's something that we need to be aware of. Just because somebody says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, and the Hadith says so, does not mean that is the ruling. That is just the raw text. And the raw text has to go through layers and layers of comprehension. That's the difference between fiqh, right? Comprehension, understanding, and issuing a judgment. The raw text is not the final say, right? You need the fuqaha. But also we need to be careful because today we have fuqaha that are basically fuqaha of the throne. So I'm not one who says that a fuqaha of the throne is the final say. So I am very clear, I'm taking what you call a very clear central thought that fuqaha are the fuqaha who actually are respected for their thought and not the ones that rationalize the continuation of coloniality, continuation of capitalism masquerading as Islam. Right? All those we have to be aware of, so we have to be both critical and engaged on both ends and not to dispense of our intellect, which is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us specifically to contemplate. Right? It's really very, very critical and important for us to do so. Now for us here in this country, as you know, we have been under almost a siege. Not from 9/11, actually it's from before 9/11. People who marks Muslim history in 9/11, there's a problem, and I write a lot about this. You just have to go back to the 60s and just see the type of nonsense that people had to do. Do you think that Muhammad Ali was worried about was interacting with the US power structure only in 9/11? Malcolm X was only as a result of 9/11? Even if you think about the Nation of Islam and their, engagement with the structure in here and the type of hostilities, it just go up and down Oakland, the Black Panther Party was just born out here in our neighborhoods. And just realize that as long as you're living in this country, you have to face structural racism. As long as you live in this country, you have to face structural racism. And you have to commit yourself to pursuit of justice. I don't have tolerance for somebody who thinks Islam is an Uncle Tom religion. I have no tolerance for that attitude. Allah in the Quran says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ, that Allah commands to justice. Allah's name is Al-Adl, is the just, the all just. Right? There is no religion in relation for me to Islam and manifesting divine attributes in this world except you have to commit yourself to justice. And committing yourself to justice means committing yourself to racial justice. Not racial us or just us. It has to be a commitment both inside the Muslim community as well outside. Because I'm very critical of, the country club Muslims, where they think Islam is just only me and my, what you call, compadres, the ones that look like me. Right? And therefore we replicate racial structures inside our institutions. So there has to be a commitment, right, to justice, to racial justice, in order for us to answer for coloniality outside as we answer for coloniality inside. You cannot answer coloniality outside without answering coloniality inside. And answering coloniality inside must be connected to answering coloniality outside. So both has to be one and connected. Malcolm X was inside as well as outside. Martin Luther King says that the bomb that were thrown in Vietnam will blow up in our inner cities. And you just take Oakland as a microcosm. It's a coloniality structure. Right? It's a colonial structure. Just think of the dynamics we have. We developed the downtown. We sold it to a developer. Right? Colonial investors. coming downtown, pushed the poor, take prostitution, drugs, pushed it to East Oakland, and cleaned the neighborhood, right? Brought the investor in for cheap, like the whole area was really for cheap. They gave them tax breaks. They gave them money to develop the area. And then they wanted what you call, you can't bring development without bringing the army, police, increasing the police to protect not the people, but the investment, right? Colonial enterprises. And those police officers, they don't come from the community, they come from Walnut Creek, they come from different areas, and therefore you created an internal colonial structure in here. And you speak about Abu Ghraib, when we have Abu Ghraib in every prison across here. The torture that was present in Abu Ghraib, you just think about the African American, the Latinos in our prison system. We're number one in the world. We have the largest prison population in the world, 2.5 million. We speak of China and prison labor. We put China to shame. We're number one. We produce more things in prison than anything. You have a license plate on your car, made in the prison next to you. You have a chair that you use in the campus, it's made by a prisoner next to you. You have army that is defending freedom across, their outfit made in a prison next to you. And therefore we have to understand those dynamics internally and have a very solid commitment, continuously and non-stop. Because silent people never make history. Silent people never make history. So if your Islam is one of silence, I am all for meditation. I am all for dhikr. I'm all for this. But silence will not actually change history. And therefore we don't need to confuse, and this is my critique, adab with silence. Spiritual courtesy does not mean spiritual silence. The least of it is that you have to have condemned in your own heart. Right? So we have to really be very perceptive of what is taking place in Nigeria, condemn it for what it is, but understand what its genealogy, understand where it came from, oppose it, but also have an opportunity to educate, as well as connected to the circumstances here in our own country, critique it, push against it, and change it and alter it, because that's what it requires for us to do in order for change our dynamics internally and externally. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعين به ونستغفره ونتوب إليه وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون. My last counsel to myself and to you is to hunker down. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Right? You entered Islam as a religion that completely attempts to disassociate you from the material world, but to manage the material world. Disassociating yourself from the material world while trying to manage the material world for yourself and for all God's creation. God's creation includes many people that are progressive and ready to do work with us. So I am also want to call you to come out of your silo. A silo where you're actually almost in an isolation and thinking that you're the only one that could make a difference. The Prophet ﷺ had Hilf al-Fudul, right? The treaty or the covenant of virtue. And we have an opportunity to have this covenant of virtue with people who are like-minded people. Right? The majority of people will respond to something that is virtuous, something that is good, and something that will improve our life collectively. So don't be a person that accepts the coloniality that thinks of Muslim as not part of a universal. We are a tradition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send the messenger to all of mankind. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. Verily, we have not sent you except a mercy to mankind. Differences in religions, tradition, that's Allah's choice. Had Allah chose for us to be one religion with one tradition, it was His choice. But He made us different to manifest the bestness and the perfection of our own tradition. So the challenge is how to be universal while at the same time to be specific within your own tradition. That's the challenge. That's where we are really, where the rubber hits the road in terms of what we try to do and to understand the requirements for it. And I hope that collectively we'll be able to do this because we have an opportunity in this country not to say anything about in this country to do something that is magnanimous, to manifest Islamic tradition and to de-link it from coloniality and present a sustainable movement and a sustainable idea for development, economically, politically, educationally, socially, and to do it collectively. That's what the task, and for me, that's what I believe Malcolm was working for. That's what some of our scholars globally were trying to accomplish, and this is the challenge that is confronting us at this particular time. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to empower us mentally to de-link and take care of our mental colonization in order for us to manifest our physical liberation. That's the challenge. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما صليت على سيدنا إبراهيم وعلى آل سيدنا إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد اللهم إني داع فأمنوا اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت وعافنا فيمن عافيت وتولنا فيمن توليت وبارك لنا فيما أعطيت وقنا واصرف عنا بالخير شر ما قضيت فإنك تقضي بالخير ولا يقضى عليك وإنه لا يذل من واليت تباركت ربنا وتعاليت اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه اللهم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على طاعتك اللهم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على طاعتك اللهم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على طاعتك اللهم ارحم المسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات يا رب العالمين اللهم ارحم المسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات اللهم ارحم المسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات يا رب العالمين وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وأقم الصلاة إن الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون